Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be back. Hope you had a nice weekend. Today, we're going to start the last section of the class called imperfect competition. An imperfect competition has two categories. It's, well, let me draw something here. I'm going to give it a shot. Not a lot of success, but I can do a little bit with the mouse. Over here with one firm, we have monopoly. Over here with perfect zillions of identical firms, identical product, we have perfect competition. Okay. As soon as you step inside this perfect competition line, where it is kind of a theoretical extreme, you're in the world of monopolistic competition. Now, it gets its name because there's lots of competition, but each firm, kind of has a monopoly because they all do it a little differently. These are differentiated products. We see this with restaurants, for example. How many zillions of restaurants are there out there? There's a lot of restaurants out there, and they all cook essentially. Well, some are more similar than others, but they all provide food. They all do it different ways. Some of them will provide the same kind of food. Let's say hamburgers. Burger King has a monopoly over the Whopper, but you know what? It's not all that different than other burgers. And retail establishments in general fall under this monopolistic competition, where there's lots of stores, lots of firms. They've got a monopoly on their own little way of doing it. They spend a lot of money on advertising. We're here where the perfect competitors don't advertise because their product's identical and nobody believes that it's different. Advertising will just be a cash outflow with no benefit. In monopolistic competition, a lot of effort is made to convince people that your product's better than the competitor. Okay. Now, this differentiation can be real or perceived. A great case where it was where the product is factually the same, okay, but through clever advertising convinced people that it's different, is sugar. Out in California, there's a company called C&H Sugar, California and Hawaii, and they run very nice advertisements on TV, and these little Hawaiian kids walking through the cane fields barefoot, and they grab some cane sugar and they start eating it. There's this song going on, C&H pure cane sugar from Hawaii. Oh my gosh, you read that, you see those kids walking through the cane fields and grabbing their sugar cane and munching on it while they're out playing around. Well, that's the kind of sugar we're going to get, by darn. And you know what? You go to the grocery store and C&H Sugar is higher priced. They're able, through their advertising, and that's the purpose of advertising. You either want to sell more at the same price, or even better, sell more at a higher price. You want a higher price. Do you want to be able to earn a higher price for your product by stimulating demand so you can get a higher price? And sure enough, C&H is a higher price than the beet sugar, produced on the mainland. It's all sugar. Sugar is sugar. But C&H has convinced people that cane sugar is a little better. I find it amazing. Maybe you remember the Jordache jeans commercials we watched earlier. Oh my goodness. They were paying 50% of sales on advertising, a huge expense to get they showed these people out there riding horses and the girl with a snake around her neck and all these commercials. I mean, they're just, they worked. And so you got a lot of money spent on advertising here, and there's of course a debate on how much that, how valuable that is as a society to spend. Is that worthwhile or not? Is it disseminating, informing people of important facts about the product, or is it just manipulating? I mean, how many facts did the Jordache jeans commercials? I mean, what did we learn about jeans? Well, nothing. So anyway, another advertising campaign that flopped years back was Chiquita Banana. Well, Chiquita tried to convince people through their advertising that their bananas were better than other bananas. I mean, it's a banana, right? So here's the thing. You have bananas on this table, and then you have other bananas on this table. So this is Chiquita, this is the other brand, and I'm looking at this brand. I'm looking at Chiquita, and I'm looking at the other brand, the cheaper brand. I can't tell the difference. They both look like bananas to me. Of course, I'm going to buy the cheaper one. And I don't think they advertise really anymore. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he tried it and succeeded. I don't know. But at least at that time, it did not succeed. And it was just a cash outflow with no benefit, just money spent on advertising. You're not getting anything back in terms of greater sales or higher price. Now, while I'm on a roll, I bought some super duper oatmeal just last week. This is supposed to be the best oatmeal. Now, let's see, it's Red Tail brand, came in a package, a third the size of the Quaker Oats package or store brand, and that cylinder, you know, comes in. A third the size, the same price. So this is like about 3 times more expensive. The best. I had to see what the best was like. So I bought it. I can't tell the difference. Can't tell the difference. You know why I can't tell the difference? Is because there's one ingredient in oatmeal. One. Oats. You don't even do anything to them. They're oats. So, but I was curious. I just had to see for myself. But I don't know. I mean, it's there on the grocery shelf. I mean, I don't know. Maybe people are buying it. I don't know how long it's been available. I don't know if it's selling well. But I know I'm going to buy the cheaper Quaker oatmeal next time because I can't tell the difference. So, guess we'll find out. Well, let me go through the monopolistic competition. You have a lot of life experience like this with this. Every time you go to the mall, anytime you go shopping, retail, restaurants, it's all around us. Lots of firms selling similar products, but differentiated, doing it their own way. They differentiated in terms of well, some of the things you see in advertising as convenient location, free parking. Friendly, knowledgeable salespeople, return for any reason, financing, tailoring for free, you know, just all kinds of things that firms differentiate. Let me go through the chapter here for a second. So let me just show you a couple of things. Okay, MindTap. Okay, you can see MindTap, right? Loading up on my screen. Anybody? Aaliyah Jensen? Yeah. Aliyah. Speak now. Speak to me.
Did you say me?
Pardon?
Did you say me?
No, I said Aliyah.
Aaliyah.
Aaliyah, man, I knew you know what? I knew, however I said it'd be the wrong one. Okay, well, I just see you there at the bottom, and I thought I'd pick on you. Got to pick on somebody once in a while. Okay, you can see my screen, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes okay, you obviously you can see my screen. You can see MindTap.
Yeah.
Okay, so sometimes I click on the wrong thing, and I just want to make sure. Okay, well, we go here to the monopolistic competition chapter. Click on read the chapter. interactive book. Okay. La da 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 da. Let me just page through this thing. Go through this chapter. Pardon? Someone say something? Okay. Just page through this thing as you read it, watch the videos and everything. And, you know, most of it I think you already know, but there's some stuff. Well, here's what I want to point out. We're not going to get real technical here with the graphs in this chapter. So just kind of skip over those. Don't worry about those. Okay, here's another one. And, you know, don't worry too much about that. But when we get here and some more, and when we get now when we get to this, some of this other stuff, start digging in a little bit more. Advertising, interesting discussion on advertising, the value of advertising, defensive advertising, how advertising affects prices, and brand names. Oh, advertising is a signal of quality. So a lot of interesting stuff here about advertising, brand names, the value of brand names, and the information of brand names, and then the conclusion. So just go through that fairly quickly. It's interesting and easy reading, but don't worry. What I'm saying is, don't worry about the graphs. Don't get bogged down with the graphs in this chapter. Okay. Now, let's go back to where I was. And now we're going to, okay, well, there's monopolistic competition. And somewhere over here, we're an oligopoly. So we've got lots of firms. As we keep going this direction, now we're down to a few firms. Now we're down to one firm with monopoly. Oligopoly is in the world here of a handful of large firms. This is big bad business. Okay. The central characteristic, the major underlying that describes it all, is they're interdependent. Not having too much luck with my mouse. Okay, and dependent. Yeah. Interdependent. These firms are unlike perfectly competitive firms. They're completely independent of each other. What one firm does has no impact on the other firms in the industry. There's so many of them, and to a large extent, same with monopolistic competition. There's an awful lot of firms. Any one firm, any one mom and pop burger joint does anything, whatever they do, probably not going to exactly send ripples through the industry. But when you have just a few firms, what one firm does impact the others in the industry. And that firm needs to take into consideration how the other firms are going to respond to whatever it is they do. So far, we've been playing golf, okay, with Monopoly. They're independent. Monopoly competition, perfect competition. You know what? You're on the golf course. You're in a golf tournament. You might not even see your opponent. Your opponent has no impact on you whatsoever. You just go out and do your thing. But now we have an opponent. We're playing tennis. We're playing basketball, football, where any strategy we use, the success of that strategy depends on what the other guy is doing. So now the ball comes back. So if we're playing tennis, we're not out there just teeing off on the golf course. That ball's coming back at me. And we have to consider in whatever strategy we do, what the response of our opponent is. And that's where we are in oligopoly. That's what makes it kind of interesting, because now we're dealing with strategy. Okay. Well, here's an example. Let's get started on this thing. Let me erase all that. Okay. Oh, geez, kidding me. Okay, so the mouse is a challenge for me, but yeah, I mean, I've seen worse. Okay, okay, I'm getting better. Here's demand curve for the computers. Let's say this is computers. And the price of computers is $1,000. And whoops. And there are 2,000 computers sold. So the amount of computers, there we are, $1,000 computers, 2,000 sold. Now there are 3 firms in the industry, firm A, firm B, firm C. Firm A produces 800 of these 1,000 computers, and that's a 40% market share. 800 is 40% of 2,000. This is the market leader. And the next firm is firm B. They produce 650. They're the second biggest firm in the industry. And that's a market share of 32.5%. And the smallest firm, firm C, produces 550 of those 2,000 computers for a market share of 27.5%. Now, all of these firms would like to increase their market share. They like to increase their sales, and they could do that a couple of different ways. They could simply step up their marketing efforts. Let's say firm A. Let's take firm A. Firm A isn't satisfied with 800 computers. They're not satisfied with 40% market share. So they are going to, they want to step up their marketing efforts and sell more computers. So they start advertising more. They tell everybody how much better their computer is and how much smarter their guys are at designing and these computers, and that you know, they got free customer support and the whole bit. So they really ramp it up. Or they could cut the price. You know, just sell more computers because it's a lower price. Now, here's the thing. Notice that there's only 3 firms. Will firm B and firm C notice if A steps up its marketing, their advertising, and starts selling more computers and maybe even stealing business away from them? Of course they're going to notice. B and C know everything A does. A knows everything B and C does. C knows everything A and B does. They all know what everybody's up to. So here's the thing. If A advertises more, B and C are going to advertise more. They're going to match that. If A cuts its price, B and C aren't just going to sit around and do nothing. Watch A steal business from them. They're going to cut their price too. In fact, one of the you know, old time classical models of oligopoly is the kinked demand curve model of oligopoly. I'll show you real quick here. That models a possible oligopoly behavior. Okay, this is firm A. This is demand for firm A computers. Notice there's a kink right where the current price is. And what that's saying is that if firm A raises its price to 1,100, they're going to lose a lot of business. The assumption is if they raise their price, B and C isn't going to follow. A raises their price, B and C is going to say, okay, go ahead and raise your price. We're keeping ours the same. they lose a lot of business for B and C. That's why it's a more elastic demand curve above the kink. Below the kink, it's a much less elastic demand curve, it's much steeper. If they lower their price to 900, they're going to gain a little business, a little. Well, why not a lot? Because B and C are going to also lower their price. So the assumption here is that the price here, and this is a characteristic of oligopoly. They don't like to compete on price. They get nervous about changing price. They don't want to raise the price because they're scared the others won't follow. If the others won't follow, they have to lower their price back down again. If they lower their price, you know the others are going to match the price cuts and may even start a price war where everybody's lowering their price, lower, lower, lower. Of course, consumers love that, but you know, that's not very good way to live if you're an oligopolist. So the prices tend to stay fairly stable in the world of oligopoly, and they compete on more on differentiation. Again, convincing people, you know, theirs is better, or having little tweaks, you know, any different features that might attract people. So it's not so much competition based on price as it is competition based on other features. So the kink demand curve. Now, I don't think our book talks about the kink demand curve. It's just one model of oligopoly. First of all, it doesn't tell you how it got to the price it's at. It just assumes whatever the price happens to be, that's where it's going to tend to stay. But sometimes prices do go up. You know, there are market leaders. If there's a firm in the industry who is the kind of the recognized market leader, they will look at their pricing and taking into consideration the whole industry, they'll raise their price and the others will follow. So when firm A, let's say they're the market leader, raises their price, then it's okay for everybody to raise their price. But if firm C decides they're going to raise their price, you know, they aren't the market leader. The others may not follow. So usually the others wait for the market leader to do so. So you can raise your price at that point. Sometimes they'll make signals to each other. They'll call a press conference, say, we've been studying the possibility of having to raise our prices. Then the other firm says in a press conference, we've been studying the possibility of raising our prices. The other firm calls a press conference, yeah, we're studying raising prices. Okay, well, I guess it's okay. Everybody, 1, 2, 3, raise your price. Perfectly legal. You can't prosecute that, you know. The thing about oligopoly is this: living in this world of interdependence, it's a tough way to go because you're always dueling with these other firms. Life would be so much easier if you just got along, right? If you just came to an arrangement. You colluded. And that's illegal. The incentive is very strong for these guys to just kind of get together and say, let's stop killing each other off. Let's stop inflicting these wounds on ourselves. Why don't we just split up the market and, you know, go happily on our way? Well, this is exactly what electrical contractors did, and we'll see a case of this in a minute. Electrical contractors bidding on Tennessee Valley Authority jobs through the government, they got tired of competing. Competing's no fun if you're a bit. I mean, competing's fun when you're playing golf and tennis, but it's not fun when you're, you know, in business. You lose a lot of nights sleep competing. You'll sleep better if you just come to an arrangement. You all get together, go out to dinner, say, okay, here's what we're going to do, guys. Well, here's what they did. They would take turns being the low bidder on contracts. So A, if it was their turn to be the low bidder, B and C would submit high bids. And of course, under that arrangement, the low bid of A's low bid was much higher than it would have been if they'd been competing. Then the next contract was B's turn to be the low bidder, and A and C submitted high bids, and then it was C's turn. Well, there was this newspaper reporter who happened to notice, and this is the funny that this is what kills me. The high bids were identical to the dollar. Now, what are the odds of that? Okay, obviously there's some collusion going on. Again, which is illegal. Firms aren't allowed to collude together for the purpose of raising their prices or increasing their profits. They can't collude against the consumer. It's a violation of antitrust laws. Now, labor unions get an exemption because it's believed, that kind of collusion on the labor side is given a pass because it's believed that it's not quite the same where an individual doesn't have the power that an individual firm does. So you might say, well, that's what labor unions do, and it is what labor unions do, but that's there's an exception for that. Well, where was I? Okay, so this newspaper guy noticed the identical bids, which is just absolutely amazing. Can't happen by chance. And these guys actually ended up going to prison, okay, because of this little scam. So that's the problem with oligopoly. They're interdependent. They don't like to compete. They would much rather, the incentives are there to cooperate. That's the thing. They're better off if they cooperate. Now, the consumers are worse off if they cooperate, but they are better off if they cooperate. Of course, cooperation is against the law in the US. Now, there are cartels. A cartel is when firms band together and try to behave as a monopoly together. A cartel, outside the US aren't illegal. There's the OPEC cartel, Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. Well, I think there's 11 members, 11 countries. They control something like 40% of the world's oil. Yeah, what they do is they have a fairly inelastic demand curve for oil. And if they can get everybody to cut production, guess what? They can send the price up. And since oil is inelastic, their revenues go up. And that's what they attempt to do with the, and you can do it when there's a small number of firms or a small number of countries in this case. You can do stuff like that. And that's why government watches them closely if firms want to merge, for example. A lot of mergers are disallowed if it's believed that there won't be enough competition left in the industry. Firms can't. Well, that's another way to get around it. All these firms could merge right into one firm. Well, that's not going to be allowed when there's only 3 firms in an industry. Not going to happen. So yeah, everybody wants to act like they're a monopoly, but they regulators do their best, at least, to not let that happen. Well, so that's a central characteristic of oligopoly. They don't like to compete. They don't like to compete on price. They don't like to compete at all. They'd rather collude. They'd like to cooperate. There's a strong incentive for them to do so. And because there are just a few firms, it's feasible. Now, monopolistic competitors would like to cooperate with each other too. They'd like to collude, but there's too many. When you got 500 firms in an industry, it's kind of hard to collude. When there's 3, you can do it. Well, let's watch that. Let's watch these case studies. The first one is talks about how GM surpassed Ford. We had really just a handful of automakers. That's an example of an oligopoly, right? We just got a handful of automakers in the US and not that many actually in the world market. Steel mills, I mean, these are big businesses, lots of economies of scale here, not enough economies of scale to be a natural monopoly, but you've got to be big here. You've got to be big to take advantage of large scale production technology, and otherwise your costs are going to be too high to compete. So there are significant barriers to entry to get in these industries. You've got to be big to even compete at all. Airlines, another case study is the airlines. They're oligopoly. We've only got 3 or 4 major airlines here in the US. And again, not all that many around the world. Steel mills tend to, any big, large manufacturing tend to be oligopolies. But anyway, let's take a look. Here we go. Whoops. Okay, do you see the Economics USA video here? I'm assuming if no one says anything, you can see and hear it. Okay, here we go.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg Lerner.
Henry Ford's Model T seemed like the perfect car. It never wore out, never went out of style. How could it be beat? The TVA and other electric companies bought hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment every year. What lengths would the manufacturers of this equipment go to make sure that the price was right?
For 40 years, regulation protected the airline industry from the hazards of competition. Have 25 years of deregulation been an improvement?
While the role of large companies has diminished in the U.S. over the past century, some crucial industries are still dominated by a few powerful companies which have grown with the economy and rewritten the rules of competition for their markets. What are the economic and legal rules these companies live by? What has big business done for and to the consumer in key markets, such as autos, utilities, and airlines? Whatever happened to price competition for these goods and services? With the help of economic analysts Richard Gill and Nariman Behravesh, we'll examine these questions on this 21st century edition of Economics USA. I'm David Shoemaker.
There's no business bigger than the auto business. If you've shopped for a car recently, this is a familiar sight. Looks like real competition, a variety of products at a variety of prices. But is what you see what you get? It was when you bought one of Henry Ford's Model Ts. Henry Ford didn't invent the car, and he didn't invent the assembly line. But he brought the two together and gave America its first mass-produced and mass-purchased car. Ford was an inventor and mechanic by trade, and no effort was spared to improve the car and to improve the process by which it was built. The Tin Lizzie looked like the same car year after year, but Ford's mechanical genius made it run better each year than the year before. His industrial genius made it cheaper to build and to buy. He paid the highest wages in industry, $5 a day. And he made a car that his workers and other working people could afford to buy. Ford's vision was to produce the perfect car, inexpensive and durable. Looks didn't count. Ford said that the customer could get a Model T in any color he wanted, as long as it was black. Richard Strout of the Christian Science Monitor owned a Model T and remembers.
They were lovely little cars. They were 7 feet high, and they were as angular as an awning, I would say, and they would take you anywhere.
It seemed as though Ford had devised the perfect competitive product. It took a beating, but it never wore out. It kept getting cheaper, and it was never out of style. Henry Ford had American drivers eating out of his hand. Model Ts weren't the only cars on the road back then. Americans also were driving Pierce Arrows and Stutz Bearcats and Duesenbergs, as well as the Chevrolets, Oldsmobiles, Buicks, and Cadillacs built by Ford's #1 competitor, General Motors, headed then by Alfred P. Sloan. According to Alfred Sloan, the primary object of the corporation is to make money, not just to make motor cars. Sloan realized that he couldn't sell his cars cheaper than Ford, so he gambled that people wanted more from their cars than a ride, and that they'd pay more for the color, variety, and options that they could get only from GM. Henry Ford may have known cars, but Alfred Sloan knew people, and he knew the 20s.
Are you having any fun? What you getting out of living? What good is what you've got if you're not having any fun? Are you having any laughs? Are you getting any loving? If other people do so, can you have a little fun?
To link his cars with the national mood, Sloan made advertising as much a GM product as the Chevy. Professor Leo Rebuffo of George Washington University has written about the car and the era.
Shrewd, in some sense, manipulative advertising, suggesting that an automobile represents your status and your personality. It's not just a way to get around, aided the appeal. And of course, the possibility that you could trade in your old car and buy a Chevy on time made it much more possible for GM to challenge Ford.
They got better looks and convenience, yes. Well, what more is there in life than those two things?
William Knudsen, who headed the Chevrolet division, who had worked for Ford, recognized that there was a stigma, as he put it, in using cheap goods that look cheap. There would be an opportunity to sell the Chevrolet by making it look a little classier than the Model T. The Chevy wouldn't look cheap as the Model T was beginning to do. The Chevy would make you proud, make you stand out.
For a while, Henry Ford stood his ground with the Model T. The man whose name meant efficiency around the world couldn't believe that Americans could choose GM's style over Ford's substance.
He said, why should he go to the trouble of providing a self-starter, after all? And why should he have a rear view mirror in the car? The joke was at the time, why have a rear mirror in the Ford car? Because whatever was behind you would pass you soon anyway.
What was passing the Ford was the Chevy. By the time the Depression started in 1929, Sloan and GM had overtaken Ford. The Model T was history. Ford brought out a new car, the Model A, that offered colors and options like GM cars did. But it was too late. Ford had to settle for second place, then for third place, behind the new company of former GM executive Walter Chrysler. We live in a world of change, but not all that much has changed in the auto industry since General Motors pushed Ford from command. GM is still in first, and consumers still watch the advertising and choose among cars that vary more in color and cachet than in cost. When economists talk about supply and demand, they're usually talking about price competition. But the battle between General Motors and Ford wasn't over who had the lowest price. We asked economic analyst Richard Gill if that holds for the rest of the economy.
What you have in the case of the American automobile industry, especially in recent years, is competition between a relatively small number of firms. We don't have a monopoly, which means a single firm in control of the industry. We don't have pure competition, which means thousands of firms selling identical products. We have a few firms in control, what economists call an oligopoly. Now, in general, oligopolistic firms like to avoid price competition. People can get hurt that way. And this automobile story brings out two ways firms can avoid price competition. One, by fiddling around in various ways with the special features and gadgetry associated with their product, what economists call product differentiation. And two, by advertising and trying to convince consumers that their special version of this product is necessary for their survival, or at least for their personal or social success. Now, this kind of competition raises all sorts of problems for the economic analyst. When you have product differentiation, for example, each firm does have a monopoly of its particular product. Only General Motors can sell a Cadillac, only Ford a Lincoln Continental, or whatever the latest brand names happen to be. As monopolists in this limited sense, it can be argued that their prices, costs, and profits may all be too high. Still, these companies are subject to competition, and after all, consumers do seem to like having such a wide variety of choice available to them. In a sense, that's exactly how GM was able to overcome Ford's early advantage. Or take advertising. Obviously, businesses use advertising to convince consumers that their products have special qualities, different personalities, really, trying in this way to increase consumer demand for them. Of course, when my competitor also does this, he is trying to increase the demand for his product at the expense of mine. How much advertising is self-canceling like this? How much contributes useful information about the products involved? Clearly, these aren't easy questions to answer, though it must be said that there are other ways of avoiding price competition that are far more dubious than those we have been discussing.
It could have been a novel. A newspaper reporter, a crusading senator, and federal prosecutors teaming up to solve the biggest crime in dollar amounts ever committed, and to put the powerful criminals behind bars. The scene of the crime is here in Philadelphia, but the story started in Knoxville, Tennessee. The Tennessee Valley Authority was a national symbol of progress, bringing electricity to millions who had lived without light. General Electric was one of its primary suppliers and one of the nation's industrial giants. In 1959, Julian Granger was a reporter with the Knoxville News Sentinel.
It was a Saturday night. I was coming in on the late shift at the Knoxville News Sentinel. I went to my box and I pulled out all the news releases and so forth. And there was the weekly or bi-weekly news release of the Tennessee Valley Authority. And I went through it, the rainfall in the valley. It was mundane stuff. And I got around to the second page, and lo and behold, this thing jumped out at me. On this bidding, Alice Chalmers, General Electric, and Pennsylvania Transformer quoted identical prices of $112,712.
Close parentheses.
Close
That was it.
So I went back to my desk, thought about it for a while, and I called Red Wagner. I told him, I seem to recall telling him, I can't believe this, Red. You know, I mean, how could you have identical bids? And he just began to unload on me. He says, the real story is down in Chattanooga, where the head of purchasing is Paul Fahey. So I did. I went down, and Paul Fahey had a stack of, it was on ruled paper, but he had case after case after case after case of identical bidding on contracts. Now, these are sealed bids, you understand. These are sealed bids. They come in a sealed envelope. But the biggest and most interesting things were the electrical contracts from big firms like General Electric, Westinghouse, Alice Chalmers. I don't think anybody really knew what the hell we had.
The TVA wasn't usually front-page news, but Tennessee happened to be the home state of Senator Estes Kefauver. Kefauver had made his name nationally with televised hearings investigating organized crime. Adopting a coonskin cap as his trademark, he had waged two popular but unsuccessful campaigns for president. Then, in 1959, Kefauver took on a new crusade against a different kind of organized crime, antitrust violators.
Kefauver announced that he was going to hold hearings in Knoxville. The word I heard was that the Justice Department decided, well, they better get moving.
Robert Bix was the Assistant Attorney General who oversaw the Justice Department's investigation of TVA's identical bid.
We came across, part by accident, a very small company in the industry and an official that was known to somebody in the antitrust division who told a story with regard to one particular product in meetings after his company had been subpoenaed to produce data. Building on that When he told the story about conspiracy in a series of meetings there, the first one or two cases were put together.
The first few confessions prompted more executives to come forward. Executives from big firms like GE, Westinghouse, and Alice Chalmers. Soon, prosecutors began to unveil the intricate design of the conspiracy.
They used assumed names, registered under false names, called each other at home rather than at the office, used unmarked envelopes. As identical bids became suspect, developed a rather complex formula known colloquially as phase of the moon, whereby to avoid detection, the bids were disparate, subject to a formula which enabled a rotating low bidder so that everybody ended up with the agreed upon percentage of the business, the theory being that detection would be well-nigh impossible.
What was it in the simplest terms that the conspirators were conspiring to do?
Trying to raise the prices at which their products were sold and make sure that each of them got what it believed to be a fair share of the market. In other words, they rigged the bids.
It's hard to understand. The electric equipment industry was an oligopoly. The executives knew that their companies could control the industry without elaborate and illegal arrangements. Why would they risk losing their jobs and going to jail? We asked Edwin Rome, a Philadelphia lawyer who argued the conspirators' cases in court.
They were driven to do what they did by reason of being devoted to the company. If this was what the company wanted them to do, they thereupon did it, just as they drove a car with somber colors and wore dark-colored striped ties and appropriate clothes to the office and so on. This, too, was another way in which, in their understanding of it, the corporate mentality worked.
What do you think was in the minds of these captains of industry? Why would they be motivated to take these shortcuts?
I guess the upside was raising the prices and what was thought to be a comparatively easier, comfortable, more predictable life for the executives. You really didn't have to worry how much business you were going to have at your end. You'd agreed on that in January.
The verdicts sent a message. Competition is the economy's most basic value. Businesses and executives who try to short-circuit competition with conspiracies and agreements would not be dealt with lightly. We asked our economic analyst, Richard Gill, why executives from these firms would want to risk fines and jail sentences trying to fix prices.
Well, the electrical industry case was fairly extreme. But if businessmen do engage in illegal price fixing from time to time, it's probably because setting prices in an industry dominated by a few firms is inherently difficult. Say you have these 5 or 6 big firms. I set a nice, comfortable price, and then you come along and set a price just under mine and take away all my business. Suddenly we are in a price war. And of course, as far as the producers are concerned, it's ruinous to everyone. In fact, economists have sometimes argued that in the few firm, the oligopoly situation, companies will have to cling to whatever their current price is. Suppose a company is selling electrical transformers for $100,000 apiece. It is selling this quantity at this price. Before it raised that price, it would have to consider, what would my rivals do? What if they left their transformers at the going price? Then I would be underbid. My sales would drop off sharply. On the other hand, if I try to cut my price and underbid my rivals, that could lead to a price war. All prices would plummet downward with little gain in sales volume for anybody. Of course, oligopolists do change their prices, particularly during inflationary periods. But they have to do it carefully, gingerly, one might say. And this raises a kind of philosophic problem. If firms gingerly meet together and fix these prices, then they are in violation of the antitrust laws and can be fined and their executives thrown in jail. If, on the other hand, they gingerly form a tacit understanding that firm A will be the price leader and that it will set prices for the whole industry, taking the interests of its rivals into account, then we often get similar economic results, yet it's all perfectly legal. Of course, there is still another way to bring order into the oligopolistic price process. Have the government set prices for you.
The airline industry has been deregulated since 1978. And it's true that under deregulation, fares have come down, but at what price? Long lines, uncomfortable seats, unequal prices, delays, safety issues. Is this laundry list of complaints justified? Has deregulation been a success? What people may forget is that the airline industry is an oligopoly, dominated by just a few big carriers.
But it was an oligopoly with a difference. For its first 50 years, a federal agency, the Civil Aeronautics Board, not the market, set the fares and the routes.
With one minor exception, the Civil Aeronautics Board had not permitted one single new competitor to come in to compete with the domestic lines. And price competition was strictly prohibited.
Southwest Airlines had to go through an agony of lawsuits and administrative proceedings in order to get started, 3.5 years, because the incumbents didn't want us to be able to compete. During that time, I got a little depressed about the system, thinking the system might fail. I mean, all we wanted to do was offer more flights at lower fares with a better quality of service, and it didn't seem to me that that was too inimical to the well-being of America.
Consumerists and antitrust people were beginning to realize that this was a cartel to protect the industry from competition. And the final demonstration of this was, who was it that was in favor of regulation? Easy. The airlines and their unions.
You would walk into a congressman's office and his eyes would get real big and he'd say, "Aren't you the smallest carrier in America?" "Yeah." "How many airplanes do you have?" "Oh, we've got 10. "And you want the industry to be deregulated? You're going to get wiped out." I said, "We don't think so." But give us a chance to be wiped out. Give us that chance to be wiped out.
So deregulation it was, and President Carter appointed Professor Kahn as chief deregulator. At first, airline deregulation was a game with only winners. There were lower fares for passengers, higher profits for well-established airlines, and new airlines for ambitious entrepreneurs. Then, in the mid-'80s, there started to be losers, too. TWA, Pan Am, Eastern, People's Express, Braniff.
Braniff International Airlines tonight is out of business.
In the era of deregulation, big airlines were inviting targets for competitors with low fares, low costs, and flashy advertising.
Getting me there on time is our way of being faithful.
You had Western, which flew in the West. You had Eastern, which flew in the East. And, East was East and West was West, and never the planes would meet. They simply did not compete with one another, and it was ordained that way. So you can get confused by thinking that less carriers means less competition. Actually, since deregulation, the number of competitive routes has increased enormously as compared to what it was prior to deregulation. And it's having carriers flying against one another on a given route that produces competition, not how many carriers there are volumetrically in the United States of America.
Where would fares be today if we had not deregulated?
What deregulation did was effectively replace the reductions in fares that had been generated by technical change, because technical change had been slowing by the time deregulation came in as the industry became more mature. And what it did was lower fares through competition.
Probably the principal source of dissatisfaction, generally regarded by the public as a failure because the public doesn't understand economics, is that traveling experience is much less pleasant.
For airline deregulation to work as efficiently as possible, you must have capacity at airports for new carriers and existing carriers to compete, for entry to expand, plus you are able to make use of runway capacity and airspace capacity. This has not been done. There's been significant congestion at airports. What this does is prevent as much competition from developing at the airport. You have restrictions on gates. All these things impede the competitive process. But they also impede the level of service. That is, with congestion, there are delays. People then blame the carriers for this problem. But this is something that could be fixed if we had what was called peak load or congestion pricing at airports, or if we had efficient investment in runways, improvements in air traffic control. In a sense, the failure of public policy to keep up with that has undermined really the performance and benefits of deregulation.
It was a success of deregulation, not a failure, that planes are 70 to 75% full, and all that goes with that. We've given people of modest means a quality price option that they didn't have before.
The virtually unanimous opinion of economists, the business community, and people who believe in antitrust is that airline deregulation has been a great success, encouraging competition and cutting rates about 40%. The familiar big business pattern of oligopoly remains, but now it's the marketplace and not the government which decides who succeeds and who fails. The era of government guarantee of routes and of profits is history. We asked economic analyst Nariman Behravesh what this experience with airline deregulation has taught us.
By many measures, airline deregulation has been a huge success. Compared with 20 years ago, airfares are virtually flat. Look at the red line in the graph. And when you adjust for inflation, the fact that most other prices have risen, ticket prices have fallen by almost a half. You can see that shown by the blue line. Two other measures of success: 3 times as many passengers are flying now than in the early 1980s, and the airline industry employs twice as many people. Many of the concerns that were voiced in the early days of deregulation have not materialized. Setting aside the risk of terrorism, airline safety has actually improved, not deteriorated as many had feared. Moreover, while a number of airlines have gone out of business, the industry has not become dominated by a few large carriers. Quite the contrary, the smaller upstart airlines such as Southwest, JetBlue, and AirTran are doing well, while the large airlines such as United and US Air are in trouble. Probably the single biggest complaint about flying these days is congestion. Flying on an airplane feels no better than a glorified bus ride. However, packed airplanes and overcrowded airports are not symptoms of the failure of deregulation. Rather, they are the consequences of its success. The problem is that the federal, state, and local governments in the U.S. have not upgraded and expanded airports and air traffic control systems to meet the spectacular increase in demand triggered by deregulation.
This 21st century edition of Economics USA has been a guided tour of some of America's 20th century oligopolies, a region of big business, non-price competition, and price makers, a kind of twilight zone of our economy where the usual rules of competition work a little differently. There's not much price competition here because, as every good oligopolist knows, that only leads to uncertainty and lower profits. Much safer to fight over style and convenience. I'm David Shoemaker.
Okay, well, there's a little bit about oligopoly and the challenges of oligopoly, the behavior and incentives oligopoly experience, and we're going to use in our chapter typically the model, the tool most used to analyze oligopoly is game theory, because you got this strategy going on, you got the responses and so forth, and incentives, and we're going to use a particular game called Prisoner's Dilemma. So before we do any oligopoly, applications, we got to know what a prisoner's dilemma is. And so there are lots of applications in economics of the prisoner's dilemma game. But before we do those, we will do the actual prisoner's dilemma. Here we go. Can you see this video, prisoner's dilemma? Anybody?
Yeah, I can see it.
Ah, good. Just making sure. When I click around a little bit, I sometimes, well, you know very well what I sometimes do. Here we go. In our study of oligopoly, we're going to use game theory, in particular, a game called Prisoner's Dilemma. Now, the way Prisoner's Dilemma works is that, well, I'll just jump to the conclusion, and this was John Nash's insight, and this is for what he won the Nobel Prize in Economics for, is that it's better in the few player situation, such as an oligopoly, and when we use games, we're talking about players and strategies and outcomes, and an oligopoly is a game in that sense. But what his great insight was, for the oligopolist, or the few player game, it's better to cooperate than it is to compete. Now, before we get on to a lot of the different prisoner dilemma type games, let's talk about what the prisoner's dilemma is. The actual prisoner's dilemma. And I'm going to use a payoff matrix to illustrate the prisoner's dilemma game. Okay. The two players in this game will be Arthur and DW. There's our two players. And the strategies in this case are to confess or not confess. I'll put stay silent. And confess. Same for Arthur. Now this is the situation. Arthur and DW are hardened criminals. They are guilty of a major crime and they are guilty of a minor crime. There's enough evidence to put them away for the minor crime, but there's not enough evidence for the major crime. So the prosecutor, they separate them, they put them in different cells, and the prosecutor makes them this deal. If they both confess to the major crime, they'll go to prison for 5 years. If they don't confess to anything, there's enough evidence to put them away for 1 year for the minor crime. However, and this is the real dilemma, if one confesses and the other doesn't, the one who confesses, they'll use that evidence against the other one, and the one who confesses goes free, while the one who does not will go to prison for 20 years. Okay, so here we are. We've got this mapped out. We have the players, Arthur and DW. We have the strategies, stay silent or confess. And in these cells, I'm going to write the payoffs to the different strategies. Starting here. In this cell, I'm going to write the payoff or the outcome when DW is silent and when Arthur is silent. Okay? Well, if they're both silent, they both keep their mouths shut, they're each going to go to jail for 1 year because there's enough evidence to convict them of a minor crime. Now, in this cell, I'm going to write the outcome if DW is silent and Arthur confesses. Now, if Arthur confesses, he goes free. If DW stays silent, she goes to jail for 20 years. In this cell, I'll write the payoff or outcome when DW confesses and Arthur is silent. Well, if DW confesses and Arthur is silent, DW goes free. She gets 0 years in prison. And Arthur goes to jail for 20 years. And in this cell, I'll write what happens if DW confesses and Arthur confesses? Well, if they both confess, they're going to go to jail for 5 years, each one of them. All right, there's our prisoner's dilemma. So what are they going to do? That's the question. Where are we going to end up with that situation? They're both sitting in their cells, and they're both thinking about this. Let's look at Arthur first. Well, what Arthur does really depends on what he thinks DW is going to do. Okay, what's best for him? So let's see. We've got Arthur. What should he do? Well, given that DW stays silent, Arthur, well, let's see. Here we have DW being silent. So we're in these two cells right here. And Arthur only cares about himself now. If Arthur is also silent, Arthur goes to jail for 1 year. Again, given DW is silent. But if Arthur confesses, he goes to jail for 0 years. He goes free. So which is better? Going to jail for 1 year or going to jail for 0 years? Well, given that DW is silent, Arthur's best strategy is to confess. How about if DW confesses? Well, let's see. Now we're over here. DW is confessing, so we're looking at these two cells right here. Given that DW confesses, if Arthur stays silent, Arthur goes to jail for 20 years. But if Arthur confesses, he goes to jail for 5 years. So which is better, 20 years or 5 years? Of course, he prefers 5. So his best strategy, given that DW confesses, is for him to confess. So, as you can see, Arthur is going to confess no matter what DW does. In other words, Arthur has a dominant strategy. A dominant strategy is one that you're going to take a particular course of action regardless of what the other player does. So no matter what DW does, Arthur is going to confess. Now let's take a look at DW. What is she going to do? Well, DW, again, just like with Arthur, depends on what the other player is going to do. So, given that Arthur confesses, well, let's start with silent. Given that Arthur is silent, what is DW's best strategy? Well, here's Arthur being silent here. So we're looking at these two cells. Okay. Given that Arthur is silent, if DW confesses, she goes free. But if DW is silent, she goes to jail for 1 year. So 0 is better than 1. So if Arthur is silent, DW's best strategy is to confess. How about if Arthur confesses? So now we are here. Here's Arthur confessing. And we're looking at these two cells right here. Which is DW best off? If DW confesses, she gets 5 years. If she stays silent, she gets 20 years. So obviously 5 is better than 20. So given that Arthur confesses, DW's best strategy is to confess. So she also has a dominant strategy. Regardless of what Arthur does, DW is going to confess. So they're both going to confess. We're going to end up here in this cell, and this here is our Nash equilibrium. Both players are going to confess. Both are going to go to jail for 5 years. Now, this is Nash's insight. If they were able to cooperate, they would have been much better off. They'd be in this cell right here. But they confess and go here. Why don't they cooperate? Let's put them in the same cell together. Let's let them talk. Let's let them promise each other. Here's the problem. Let's say DW. She's thinking, okay, Arthur, he's been a good guy. He's a good older brother. If you've seen the TV show Arthur and DW, my kids grew up with that, and I had a couple of them exactly like those two. So anyway, I digress. But Arthur, or DW, thinks Arthur's been well, I don't know how good an older brother was in the show, but let's pretend that he was a good brother. He's not going to lie to me. I'll stay silent. He'll stay silent. And then we're both going to go to jail for 1 year. But then she starts thinking, but what if he does confess? It's a long way from 1 year to 20 years. A long way. And Arthur's thinking the same thing. Well, DW wouldn't lie. I know she's going to say silent. Ooh, but what if she doesn't? That's an extra 19 years. So unless there's some kind of really powerful commitment device, a commitment device, well, that's something that forces you down here, forces you to cooperate. Now let's suppose that these are members of a very big and powerful organized crime family. What's the commitment device? Okay. If these two confess, or if anybody confesses, they probably have a machine gun waiting for them as soon as they walk out of the prison. So total fear might push them down into here. So some kind of commitment device. Well, absent a commitment device, again, we're going to end up with our Nash equilibrium here. And a Nash equilibrium, if I didn't mention it already, is when neither player has an incentive to change their strategy. And in this case, really, neither player really has an incentive. So competition gets you here. Cooperation gets you here. Now, this is precisely when we apply this to oligopolies, businesses. They don't like to compete. Competition gets you here. Cooperation, collusion, forming a cartel gets you here. So we'll address that in later examples. Okay, gang, that's enough for today. We won't do any more with game theory today. I just want to introduce you to it, and so that you know, when we do go over these other applications, more economic in nature, you'll be able to know what we're doing. So, okay, well, that is it for today. So we'll check out a little early. So have a good week. No, wait, what's today? Not a good weekend. Today's Tuesday. Have a good 2 days. See you back on Thursday, and then we'll have a good weekend. All right, gang. See you later, and see you Thursday.